For me, my appreciation of Doctor Who has always been kind of abstract. It's more an appreciation for what it represents than what it actually is. And I know that's weird. I know that's really, really strange. I don't have the sentimental attachment that a lot of people have for Doctor Who. I was born in 1984, so at the point that it was cancelled and went away, I was only a kid. I wasn't even formulating coherent memories at that point. So my experience of Doctor Who is not sentimental. I don't have attachments to it. I don't remember it growing up or anything like that. It was part and parcel of the culture in which I grew up. It was referenced endlessly. So references to the Daleks are everywhere, references to the TARDIS, the theme tune cropped up every now and then. I knew what Doctor Who was because it was ambient, because it had become culturally enshrined at that point. And I saw reruns of the show all over the place, on UK Gold as it was, Dave as it now is. I do recall one of the first episodes I ever watched, which I think was a Tom Baker episode, where I can't remember what it was called, but it involved these giant alien maggots in a mine somewhere, and the imagery of the maggots stuck with me, because by that point, even though I was phenomenally young, like a really young child, easily single digits, I'd already developed a penchant for the dark and the morbid and the macabre, so I really responded to the images of these giant maggots in this desolate kind of almost like lunar landscape that was obviously a quarry. I mean, that's where they shot most of the alien or lunar landscapes in Doctor Who at the time, because it was easy and cheap to do. What I mean by which I appreciate what Doctor Who represents is that what Doctor Who is a very rare means of getting very abstruse, strange, and transgressive imagery, concepts, subjects, and media into the British living room. It's a means of getting imaginative material to mainstream audiences who might otherwise be insulated against it, who were glutted on a diet of reality television shows and very poor documentaries and news broadcasts and soap operas and social tracts and whatnot. That's what Doctor Who is to me at its most ascended state. I didn't really come to Doctor Who until The Resurrected Who, and even that took some convincing. I was not that interested in it when I heard that it was being resurrected, other than the fact that Russell T Davies was involved, and I really rather liked a lot of his earlier work, things like Queer as Folk, for example. Well, being a young gay guy of my generation, of course I was going to respond to Queer as Folk, because it was one of the first TV shows that sincerely spoke to me, that was for me and was about me, clearly. But it was interesting to me. It was interesting. I remember the first episode I saw was the episode Dalek, and I saw that at a friend's house. I was home from university. I was very young, like 19, 20 maybe, and the episode Dalek was sort of on in the background, and I paid attention to it. I was actually quite intrigued. I was intrigued because I was very skeptical. I didn't know how they were going to take something as hokey and ridiculous as the Daleks and make them engaging for a present-day audience and make them threatening enough, make them a credible threat. I thought that was kind of absurd. And they managed it. In the episode Dalek, they really managed it. Obviously, the entire impetus for that episode was, okay, we've got to really sell this ostensibly ridiculous design, this thing that looks like a big wheelie bin with egg whisks and plungers attached to it. We've got to make it credible, and they do. They really do, and the way they do it is very clever. They do it not through the design, but through mythologizing it. They do it through the writing, which is really clever. They introduce this notion of the Time War. They introduce the notion of the Daleks being this mutant species that the Time Lords are at war with at one time. The notion that they annihilated the Time Lords and ultimately ended up annihilating themselves at some point. You've got the hatred the Doctor has for them and the fear that he has for even this one. It's really clever the way it's built up. It's the way the threat of this thing is built up and the way it demonstrates its own capacity. I mean, it kills hundreds of people in that episode. It's really good. And you get the wonderful imagery of the thing splitting open, the pepper pot thing splitting open, and the Lovecraftian mucal brain squid thing inside, which is wonderful. I loved all that imagery, and that's kind of what sold me. And from then on, I was kind of sold on the show. You know, I was going to watch it regardless. It hasn't always, in fact, it hasn't often fulfilled on its promise to me. But that's not really the point. When it does what I said earlier, when it acts as a kind of conduit for deviant material, for transgressive, imaginative material, that's when it's at its best. And when it does it so hard. When it does it well, it does it really well. And that's what personally, that's what I want from it. I don't think Doctor Who should ever be conciliatory. I don't think it should ever be safe. And I don't think it should ever be reinforcing. I don't think it should be conservative. By its very nature, I don't think it should be conservative. I don't think science fiction, by its nature, should be conservative. For me, the notion of conservative science fiction is an oxymoron. It's a total oxymoron. The whole purpose of science fiction is to be transgressive. It's to provide abstract arenas by which certain assumptions and norms and systems can be criticized and questioned. That's the whole purpose of science fiction. Whether it be dystopian, utopian, whatever format it occurs in, that's its fundamental purpose. And if it doesn't do that, if it reinforces establishment and assumption, then it's doing it wrong. It's doing it wrong. And sometimes Doctor Who does do that, unfortunately. It's done it more under the Chibnall era than it has under any era before. And don't get me wrong, I mean, Moffat has his own little conservatisms that creep in from time to time. But I will say this, that Moffat did allow for some of the more deviant and transgressive ideas in Doctor Who to go for it, you know, to actually manifest. And I really liked that. I really, really appreciate when it does that, when it's a bit deviant, not only with regards to its symbolism and to its cultural relevance, but to it within itself, when the show is allowed to question its own assumptions, which it sometimes did under Moffat and did quite a lot under Russell T Davies. Under Chibnall, sadly, it hasn't. Under Chibnall, it became very conservative. I mean, here's a really good example. In the space of a season, so between the last Peter Capaldi season, which had Bill as the companion, which was actually generally pretty good, and the first Jodie Whittaker season, you have this situation where in the Peter Capaldi series, you have the episode Oxygen, which is not necessarily a great episode, but it is this very deviant and transgressive episode. It basically provides a very simple extrapolation of where capitalism is ultimately taking us, the sort of self-destructive nature of capitalism. What Oxygen states bluntly is that given the chance, capitalism will end up charging us for the very air we breathe, if it was allowed to. And that's absolutely true, and will ultimately result in the dissolution of its own systems. So very deviant, very transgressive, very contrary to the philosophies that are predominating culture itself. So what science fiction should do. Then, in the space of a season, you get the episode Kablam. The episode Kablam, in which the Doctor herself doesn't apologise for, but actively justifies the abuses of what is effectively Amazon with regards to its workers and the environments in which they operate, and the wider cultural and industrial effect companies like Amazon have. You actively have the line, the problem isn't the systems, the problem is people within the systems. I mean, it's awful. I mean, that is a betrayal, ultimately, of what Doctor Who should ideally be about, and what it's always been about. If you go back to the classic shows, like the pre-Russell T Davies shows, the original run, what you got there, for all of its faults, and by God there were many, you were often getting jobbing writers who were just coming out of university, so they were very left wing. You know, they were they were working class kids who studied Marx and studied other thinkers and whatnot that had revolutionized their minds. And so if you watch the classic Doctor Who episodes, what you almost always get are these subversive critiques of establishment. You get these very left-wing ideas, these socialist ideas that are peppered throughout, and that is just part and parcel of the show. To have a present-day incarnation of the Doctor that is apologizing for and justifying the abuses of a company like Amazon it's where I step out. It's where I don't want to be part of it, and it's really sad for me. That's not what Doctor Who should be about. It certainly shouldn't be anything that the Doctor is about, as a character, and it's a real shame. It's a real shame because for me, I really wanted this series of Doctor Who to be the best it ever was, if only to shut up those misogynist arseholes, those chuds, those knuckle draggers who just don't like the fact that the character is regenerated into a woman, who don't want women anywhere in their science fiction that they think they own, bizarrely, who don't think that women have a place anywhere. Quite frankly, when you extrapolate the argument, the position out to its ultimate extremes, they don't think women have a place anywhere. I wanted it to be the best, and sadly it's not. It's just not. It has real problems. I mean, the writing is very conservative, very comforting and reinforcing of norms rather than questioning of them, and it's a real problem for me. Anyway, for me, I'm speaking obviously subjectively, personally. I'm not having a go at people who liked the Jodie Whittaker seasons up to this point. I'm really not. There are a couple of episodes I really liked myself, but for me, it hasn't worked. This under Chibnall, it hasn't worked, and I'm kind of glad to see that there's going to be a new version of Doctor Who very soon without Chibnall, with a new head writer. I hope they get someone in who can appreciate what Doctor Who can be at its most ideal. I mean, that's the strength of the show, of course. If you don't like a season or a writer or a doctor, just wait and you'll get a new iteration of the show before long, and that's what we're going to be getting. I just hope that whoever comes in really gets the innate deviance of the show, the transgressive potential of the show, and goes for it, really goes for it, because that's when it's strongest. That is when it's at its strongest, when it's doing things that are unexpected, that are clever, that are deviant, when it is really burrowing into its science fiction roots and influences, and it is bringing these deviant and transgressive and interesting ideas to the fore. I really want that stuff to be pumped into the living rooms of like Little Britain, of your main, certainly England anyway, because we need it. We need that kind of material. We are facing in this culture an existential abyss right now. We are sliding so fast and so deep into it, where we're enjoined to all be the same. We're all enjoined by the assumptions and the systems that be, to think the same, to look the same, to act the same, to imagine and think the same, to want the same. What Doctor Who and shows like it, material like it, can do is counteract that. At its very, very best, it can counteract that. And you see that with some of the best story arcs for the companions. Now, the companions can be really contentious because very often they're not that well written or well conceived, and their dynamics to the Doctor are questionable. But if you look at some of the very best ones like Bill, for example, Bill has for me the perfect companion story arc. She's a bit unusual anyway. She's a bit outside of the fishbowl looking in when she meets the Doctor, and through the experiences that she has with him, she is literally transformed. She actually becomes more than human by the end of her story arc, and for me, that's a yes. That's a big ass yes. I can't stand these story arcs where the companions leave the Doctor and then go back to their normal lives. I can't stand it when the show tries to enshrine banality and domesticity as though it's in any way comparable to what the Doctor provides, because it just isn't. It just isn't. It's a kind of death. It's a kind of suicide. I really hate it. I really can't stand it. I don't know how anyone who's experienced that kind of broadening of their horizons can ever go back to paying bills again, to operating within these staid, petty little assumptions and systems. I just don't get it. I don't understand it. It's a kind of hell. It's a kind of hell. It's why Donna is the best companion by a country mile, by the way, for me. I love her. I love her to bits. It's why it's simultaneously the best and the worst. You get that fleeting moment when she becomes the apotheosis of all the companions should be, when she effectively becomes becomes the Doctor, you know, where she sees as he does, she sees everything he can, but is also her own entity. She is the Dr. Donna, her own entity, but then loses it, sadly. It's like, it's hell. That is hell. It would have been better. If I were in her position, I'd have said to him, don't you fucking dare, even if it's for these few brief seconds, let me burn out. I'd rather my brain burn than go back to that. Yeah? And that would have been the kind thing to do, not what he does, which is, of course, take it away from her. That would have been the kind thing. But Bill actually gets it. Bill actually is transformed. By the end of her story arc, she becomes effectively a new order of life form, transcendent from humanity. And that's what we should... That, for me, is the ideal companion story arc. Because you would be transformed by what you experience with the Doctor. You would not come back... You would not even yearn to come back to domesticity. Most people wouldn't. It's a contradiction, you know? And it's a kind of way that when the show is at its most conservative, it's a way that it apologizes for itself. It apologizes for its deviance, and I hate that. No, run with it. Run with the deviance. More like Rose. You know, Rose had this story arc as well, where she couldn't go back to her old life. She refused to. And I loved that. I loved that. It's when you get the banal, the enshrinement of banality. I hate that. I hate it in any science fiction. I hate it in fantasy. I hate it in horror. I hate it in fiction in general, to be honest. I really hate it. At its most ideal, it's when the companions, it's when the stories actively rail against that, and I love it. I love it when they do, and I sincerely hope any new showrunner, any new incarnation of the show takes it down that route. I hope they understand the potential of the show when it comes to inspiring new imaginations, new ideas, maybe inspiring a new generation of writers out there, you know? It has the potential for that, and that's what I've always wanted it to be. Of course, it doesn't always live up to those standards. It rarely lives up to those standards, arguably, but even so, fingers crossed, Fingers crossed.